if I can impart on you three things today, all have considered our time together a success. The first is that illegal immigration good, legal immigration is good, illegal is bad, is a flawed and terrible narrative. Number two, when it comes to immigration, the numbers matter. Number three, the harm done the country by out-of-control employment visa programs and liberal immigration policies is significant, but there are solutions. While the border crisis is certainly a significant aspect of the immigration conversation and based on what's trending in the news, perhaps the most salient one today, it's not the only immigration issue. I'd argue that the border crisis and immigration are separate issues. Granted, there should be zero tolerance for those that shirk our immigration laws and pass into the country illegally. We should be equally concerned with the numbers of people entering the country each and every year legally. Today, we issue anywhere from between 6 to 8 million non-immigrant visas each year. Before the Biden administration took over and created the fiasco that is our southern border, the largest source of illegal immigration was from those that came here legally on visas and overstayed. Notable centrists like Elon Musk have adopted the notion that illegal immigration is bad and legal is good. They will voice their umbrage saying that, wow, they're flooding the southern border with people that are going to dilute the vote and favor Democrats in office. While with the same breath, they will say things, and I quote, we want to massively expand legal immigration. Those that are hardworking and won't commit crimes should be welcome to this country, unquote. So in other words, what they're really saying is, please replace us, just do it legally. The United Kingdom and Canada adopted the Elon Musk policies, and they are now paying a hefty price for it. The Tories promised that Brexit would reduce the number of legal immigrants, but instead increased legal pathways that resulted in record-breaking immigration numbers that are far greater today than they were in the past. Prior to 1994, for instance, immigration and emigration to the United Kingdom were roughly balanced. However, last year, roughly 1.2 million people immigrated to the country and only about 532,000 emigrated. And now 9% of the United Kingdom are foreign-born. In light of this, what did the Tories decide to do? Well, they focused on trying to stop people crossing the channel in boats, and rather than going after legal pathways to immigration. And they were rightly and justifiably thrown out of office last week in the elections. But let's talk about our neighbor to the north. What can we learn there? The record-breaking legal immigration numbers to Canada played a major role in reducing per capita GDP, and much like here, causing a massive housing crisis and also depressing wages. Much of this harm was done by this notion, and we hear it here in the States a lot, staple a green card to a diploma. And it's certainly a policy our Silicon Valley overlords would like to see us adopt. Also, ethnic strife between Sikhs who call themselves Khalistanis and Hindu Indians is a common occurrence now in the streets of Brampton, all thanks to them coming on student visas and then applying for green cards and eventually obtaining Canadian citizenship. As they say, import the third world, get the third world. The cabal running the immigration policy under the Biden administration will happily call your bluff on the notion of illegal bad, legal good. For instance, in an attempt to bring some order, and Tom talked about this earlier, the Biden administration uses the CBP1 app and they've altered it, really bastardized it, so that they can admit thousands and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people to the country I don't know if we call it legally, pseudo-legally, the margarine of legal, but that's what's being done, quote unquote, to say that they're legally admitting people that are technically inadmissible. And once they're admitted, they get paroled into the US, and parole may have been intended for very specific situations, but is now being used to allow those who are inadmissible to temporarily stay in the US until they can find a way to adjust their status, i.e., get a green card. Moreover, if you're an alien who illegally crossed the border into the country, or if you overstayed your visa and you don't want to ever be deported, as Mark talked about earlier, you can always file for asylum and be provided with a work permit. And while you're waiting for your case to be heard before an immigration judge, you get your, which can take about 10 years. This is all legal, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you're a victim of a crime on US soil and you're an immigrant, you may be entitled to a U visa. The U visa was created in 2000 as part of the Victims in Trafficking and Violence Protection Act. Since then, we have seen a rise in aliens staging fake crimes to get the benefit of obtaining the U visa, which provides a pathway to citizenship. Now, there were two recent incidents that involved aliens working at gas stations who paid someone to rob them so they could file a police report saying that they were a victim of a crime. Ironically, things took an unintended turn for the worst when a good guy with a gun in the gun-friendly state of Texas saw the crime being committed and shot the assailant. Yes, it actually happened. This is in Hollywood. So another form of legal immigration. Let's talk about anchor babies. Many of you are probably aware of the process by which a non-citizen enters the country, has a child here, and that child is a US citizen. They're given a Social Security number. However, you may not be aware that the largest racket for anchor babies is not illegal aliens who come to the country and have kids. Rather, it's those coming on tourist visas for the express purpose of having a child here so they can obtain an American passport for that child. Miami is a hotbed of this for Russian tourists. Phoenix has a huge Nigerian anchor baby industry, and Los Angeles has a well-trafficked Chinese anchor baby trade. We'll talk more about the H-1B visa later. That was created with the Immigration Reform Act in 1990. But that act, the Immigration Reform Act of 1990, also created the diversity visa. The annual diversity lottery, and it's a lottery, randomly issues 50,000 green cards to anyone from anywhere who submitted an online application. No consideration is given for skills, educational attainment, let alone character. Understand, once submitted, these people are given a pathway to citizenship. Now, since the 1870s, immigration has been used by business interests to beat down wages and keep the wage-earning classes off balance. But 120 years later, it's being weaponized now to bring down the salaries of professional white-collar workers. In the 1980s, Eric Bloch, who was the director of the National Science Foundation, foisted on us a report that was neither peer-reviewed nor actually published. And it basically said, roughly 600,000, we're going to have a deficit of 600,000 STEM workers. That's science, technology, engineering, and math. And we need to create a visa employment program that will remedy that. Well, that's how we got the H-1B visa. And this bogus report that it was predicated on was enacted in 1990 by Congress. And I say bogus because in a market-driven economy, labor shortages simply don't exist in the long run. A shortage of workers increases demand in that particular field, and it drives wages up, which attracts more people into the field. And that's exactly what happened in the 1980s and 1990s. Americans learned to code. Not such a good idea anymore. The call to bring in more foreign white-collar workers and STEM workers is an attempt to solve a problem that doesn't exist. The reality is that we do not have a STEM worker shortage in America. For instance, only 1/4 of those graduating with STEM degrees are actually working in STEM. This is largely because wages have been stagnant for the past 25 years. It always comes down to supply and demand. The H-1B visa is issued to skilled aliens working in white-collar jobs, and it's a scam because a person can, and often do, make up phony resumes. They kind of create a resume with these bogus day-to-day job responsibilities that they give to our USCIS officers as to why they deserve an H-1B visa. So interestingly enough, 3/4 of all H-1B visas issued go to one country, and that's the country of India. Right. Now, there's a belief out there that the H-1B visa brings in highly skilled immigrants. This is not true. They're pretty much ordinary workers because, oddly, the process of obtaining an H-1B visa is not predicated on identifying and recruiting the best and the brightest. It's a random lottery that decides from a pool of applicants each year who receives and doesn't receive the visa. Now, to ensure getting a larger share of applicants of the roughly 85,000 slots, unscrupulous companies like several dozen Indian IT outsourcing consulting firms, or as I like to call them, body shops, submit applications for jobs that don't exist. Once the H-1B recipient arrives in the US, they're rented out to a US company that thinks they're getting a qualified STEM worker, and it's a lucrative trade. One H-1B visa IT consulting firm, Infosys, brought in over $4.5 billion in revenue in the second quarter of this year alone, and that's a 22% increase over the prior year. Big tech companies like Apple and Facebook were recently prosecuted by the Department of Justice for using deceptive tactics to deter American citizens from applying for jobs so that they could help foreign visa workers get employment-based green cards. For instance, what they'll do things like this. They'll hire immigration attorneys to ensure that no Americans submit their resumes for jobs that they're, when they have to go through what they call a perm process, they have to basically publish a job to see if there are any Americans available. And to that end, what they'll do in these instances is the jobs get posted in old newspapers, and to apply for the job, one had to send their resume by snail mail. And these companies purport to tell us that there is a shortage of high-skilled talent. So, in conclusion, there are solutions. First, programs such as H-1B, L-1, optional practical training aren't being used. They're actually working exactly the way the framers intended them to do, and that is displace American workers and also drive down labor costs. Towards the end of President Trump's administration, 3 rule changes were proposed that would have declawed the H-1B program. And they were, he tightened up the definition of what a specialty occupation were, because interestingly enough, these high-skilled workers are coming in to be golf course groundskeepers as well as programming computers. He raised the prevailing wage, and that's helpful because companies enjoy a 20 to 40% benefit of bringing on an H-1B over a native-born American or someone who is lawfully present in the US. And he also replaced the lottery I mentioned with a process that would give a company willing to pay the highest wage first dibs on a foreign worker. That would erase the competition with ordinary STEM workers here in the US. Now, these rule changes were left to die on the vine by the Biden administration, and they need to be implemented by the next administration. Or I'd even offer the whole program needs to be ended. Second, we need to stop using the student visas as a discrete pipeline for getting cheap labor. Optional practical training, or OPT, must be eliminated. It was not legislated into existence. Rather, it's probably the most salient example of bureaucratic overreach today, and actually speaks directly to Chevron and the notion of deference. OPT grants a 3-year employment authorization document to any foreign student graduating with a STEM degree, and right now there are actually more people here on a optional practical training employment authorization document than there are in H-1Bs. And I would also recommend that Congress needs to ask the Supreme Court to revisit and hear a court case called Washtec versus DHS. And it was very clear that the student visa is designed to be just that. Basically giving a 3-year work authorization to someone who graduates, who's a foreigner, hasn't been legislated. It's purely deference, and it was created in a backroom deal between Bill Gates and Michael Chertoff. Third, end the diversity lottery. Enough said there. Fourth, amnesties don't work. Prior to 1986 and Reagan's Immigration Reform and Control Act, roughly 1 million people would come north every year and 1 million people would go south. Because of the amnesty that was embedded in the act, people in the country legally began to stay. Now, in 1986, illegal immigration was about a 3 million person problem. Today, conservatively, and Tom would know more about this than I would, it's easily 13 million people. So again, amnesties do not work. Fifth, and Tom spoke to this a little bit, heavily taxed remittances. As Tom mentioned, last year, $70 billion went to just one country, left the country, went to the country of Mexico. In 2022, over $200 billion was left the country in remittances to foreign countries. And finally, the Immigration Act in 1965 created significant changes that still haunt us today, and the following must be legislated to counteract the Act's negative consequences. Number one, move priority from family to those who possess extraordinary abilities, end chain migration, only nuclear families, that's a spouse and children under the age of 18, and have a high-skilled point system. And lastly, enact a comprehensive U.S. history requirement. And so that's what I see as the problem when it comes to legal immigration and some solutions. And I want to thank you all for your time today.